It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Richard Ratcliffe. We were just talking before we started about the fact that we first met 25 years ago this fall when we had the ethics complaint. Some of you have read this in the book. We had the ethics complaint before the Ethics Commission's adjudicative panel. And Richard came on behalf of the Attorney General, who at that time was Jim O'Neill, to say, we would like you to postpone this portion of the DiPrete case because it was the case about Only Pond, which some of you have read, because we have a grand jury in process. I was thrilled to hear that, but I absolutely did not want them to postpone. He and I go a long way after that, and you have read about him in the book, most notably in the journals, two significant supplements, Rhode Island on Trial from 1998, which you have in the Dropbox folder. It's amazing. If these were made into a paperback book, you'd have a real paperback book. There's so much material here. And of course, those of you who have seen part of it in the Dropbox are aware of how truly important what he did was. And that's what come on in. What we want to do this morning is talk a little bit about that. I do want to say, by way of disclosure, that after Richard left the Attorney General's office, we had him come on. We invited him onto the board of Common Cause, and I was very happy that he agreed to that. And so this relationship is a long one and an important one. I interviewed him for the book, and I didn't highlight all of his comments, but there were some real insights, particularly into the DiPrete investigation. And that's particularly what I wanted to encourage him to share with you today. So we have the iPad. We're going to record this for history's sake. I began to realize that some of the people who had played important parts in this story have died. People like Mike Linehan. I have an audio recording of my 3-hour interview with him. But I sort of said, as long as people are going to bother to come, let's see if we can capture this. This is not highly professional, but at least it'll be a permanent record. And as Dave said, you'll be able to ask questions. So, maybe what you do would be to write down questions that you may have. And we haven't rehearsed anything. I've made a note of a couple of questions, but we haven't rehearsed it. And so we're just going to relax. And if there's a pressing question, raise your hand and we'll call on you. And if not, we'll come to the end after maybe half an hour, 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Does that make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. The interesting thing was, next week we're going to talk about Risdick, that awful disaster. And Richard was really working on the Risdick case when he got into the DiPrete case. And I wonder, Richard, if we could start off by you talking to us a little bit about how that happened, how you started the Mollicone stuff even before Bruce Sutherland was inaugurated, and just some of your reflections from that time.
Well, I do remember Walter Gorman, who I don't know. He became a judge, a district court judge afterwards. He came. Jim O'Neill had brought him to the Attorney General's office. He was from Washington, D.C. He had worked in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and initially he came to Rhode Island as a deputy attorney general, basically in charge of litigation, to run the litigation. And he had basically, he was in charge of most of the white-collar investigations. I worked with him previous to this on a case involving some bankers in Newport by the name of Ralph Flint and Richard Page. who had stolen money, embezzled money from Bank of Newport. So I remember I was in my office and he came in and he said that there's been a major defalcation at a bank up on Federal Hill. And I sort of had a look at my, this was before you could just Google defalcation, so. Walter liked to use big words. Defalcation is basically a theft.
Thank you.
So, and I remember that the state police were going out to interview the major stockholder or owner of the bank by the name of Joe Mollicone. And I know that I was supposed to meet actually a very good friend of mine for lunch, and I said, I just can't come to lunch, there's something going on. And basically it took off from there as to, a few days later, Joe Mollicone decided that he did not want to stay in Rhode Island. And you know, the more you dug with respect to the Heritage Bank, the more we became aware of the tangled web that Joe Mollicone had created and the various partnerships that he was involved in, these real estate partnerships, and he seemed to have very influential partners in the partnership, and lo and behold, most of the leased property, most of the property that they owned was leased to the state of Rhode Island. So that sort of was the genesis of the beginning of the investigation involving the lease portion, the leases of property.
Including some buildings that are still in, I was in one last week,
101 Friendship Street.
Yeah, and it's where DC WAF is, for those who don't know. It's across from the family court building. So after all these years, it's still...
Correct. And in fact, one of the things that we investigated was how the lease ended up at 101 Friendship Street, and how the whole thing was orchestrated with respect to the word went out that that's the one that they're supposed to take. So, you know, the management was supposed to rate the buildings, and 101 Friendship Street came up highest on the list. But it was all, it was not a, it was an inside deal, as they say. It was not, it was orchestrated. I mean, everybody knew ahead of time that that's where the Department of Labor and Training was going to go, to 101 Friendship Street. And one of the problems with that building was that, from a fire point of view, there's that big central, and
it has a big central airway.
Yes,
that goes right up to skylights, and if you're on the ground floor, you still get nice light coming down.
you do. But there was a concern about a fire hazard in that building, but that never really went anywhere. These are just my memories, you know, going back 25 years. So just to go on, what happened? You know, what happened after that was, at the same time, the Journal had done a piece, I believe, on the Public Building Commission. So you had the issue of why are all these leases going to these well-connected people, and then you put that with the Public Building Commission, which is allowed construction management jobs rather than sealed bids to select architects, engineers, and other professionals to work on buildings. You have a construction manager would then select the architect, the engineer, and the construction manager would do that. So that was we sort of had a two-pronged investigation involving selections of construction managers, architects, engineers, and the awards of leases.
So how did you get then back to Governor DiPrete and Henry Fasano? And I'm thinking about the question of the check for Renza's rug.
Oh yeah, Renza's rug. Poor John Renza. Who really wasn't I mean, he was more of, he was a very proud man, and he more of a victim of I think of the political pressures that were being put on him. And I think he was basically an honest person. And So one of the issues that came up was, we found this check and it said rug for John Renza, and we wanted to investigate as to, why did he get a rug? Was there any sort of a quid pro quo? And I don't think there was. I think it was, we basically determined afterwards that it was basically, thanks a lot for, playing along, and here's a little gift. It was a very nice oriental rug, but John Renza was, he was a person who actually passed out in the grand jury room when we started questioning about the rug, and eventually he ended up cooperating, and I think that Lieutenant Maddox had seized the rug. I don't know where the rug is, if the rug ever went back to John Renza, but it's probably in some warehouse somewhere. But John Renza, he liked being the head of DLT. He liked
Department of Labor and Training.
Yeah, and he was a pretty good guy. He was told what to do, and he did it.
And the governor's chief of staff was one of the partners.
Yes, the governor's chief of staff. So there were, Henry Fasano was a partner, the governor's chief of staff. But the other issue that we had is, we started getting the partnership, looking at who owned the partnership, the governor's chief of staff had 2 shares, everybody else had 1 share. So the question became, well, why does he have 2 shares?
You begin to get the picture of what it would be for some person who didn't have connections to try to get a contract. So you went further with this. You mentioned Bob Maddox. Tell people a little about him.
So Bob
I
Maddox,
interviewed him for the book, and he's an amazing character.
he's a really interesting guy. He's tenacious investigator. He's as honest as the day is long. He's the type of guy, he would come to work and he had an innate ability to focus on, he'd be able to focus on documents, but he wasn't really a paper guy. He would be able to pull out interesting information, and he had a very good sense of, this means something. He wasn't always right, but a lot of times he was right, and he would follow up on different leads. But he would come in at 8:30 or 8 o'clock, he'd start working, it would be 12 o'clock, the brown paper bag would open up, the lunch would come out, he even brought the little juice box, and 15 minutes later, the bag would throw it back and back to work. But he was a funny guy. We had a lot of fun working on the case, and it's when you add the human element of people sometimes are more motivated to tell the truth when they're a little afraid. Sometimes they lie, but just the whole human element of the foibles of human nature. Bob Maddox always, he looked for the girlfriend. If you can find, you're basically trying to gather information, find out what you need to know, put people in a situation where they have, you know enough so that they have no alternative but to tell you the truth, because you might suspect that people don't always tell the truth the first time that you speak to them.
So you assembled, first would you describe the grand jury room and process a little bit for people?
Okay, so the grand jury there's 23 people on a grand jury, and those 23 people are drawn from throughout, it was a statewide grand jury drawn from throughout the state. And there are 2 types of grand juries. This was an investigatory grand jury, which you'd hear people would come in, and the grand jury was being used to investigate. So people would be compelled to testify before the grand jury. Oftentimes, people would invoke privileges, and then we'd have to make a determination whether or not we want to immunize them. And after the so in the grand jury also has the power to issue subpoenas. The basis, in a grand jury, all as a grand jury does is determine if there's probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed and somebody committed the crime. So it's more likely than not. It's basically the civil standard. The grand jury only hears from one side, the prosecution. There's no defense lawyer. There's a stenographer that's in the grand jury. The proceedings in the grand jury are secret. When an indictment is released, oftentimes the grand jury transcript is then released. So once indictments came out, the grand jury transcript was released so that there could be access to the grand jury testimony for the defendants preparing for trial. And sometimes it ends up in the discovery package so that it's available. The press can look at grand jury transcripts sometimes. If no indictment is returned, it's sealed and it remains secret. So we actually, the grand jury investigation of the DiPrete case really lasted almost 3 years. We were in 2 different grand juries. A grand jury can last 18 months. So you bring people, we brought different people in before the grand jury to testify and gathered. We used the grand jury was used to gather a number of documents regarding the issues that we were investigating.
How did you go from seeing some of these associates of Ed DiPrete as players to saying it's not just them, it's the governor? And would you describe kind of the case that you began to assemble against the governor himself?
Well, what happened was there were some of the we were able to get different contractors, for example, to cooperate. We were able to find one of the things that's most, so just talking about human nature, we determined through talking to people that different architects, engineers, construction managers were being solicited by, you know, the DiPrete administration, or the DiPrete fundraising machine was very, you know, it was almost like you have DiPrete and his son Dennis were at the top, and then you sort of had the lieutenants below that. So if, for example, there was an individual by the name of Frank Zano who was involved, he was an HVAC guy, and he would solicit other architects and engineers and basically told them what they had to contribute. One of the ways to determine, to put people in a compromising position so that they would then want to cooperate with us was that you could find that, you know, if you have to pay, say, $2,000 or $3,000, $5,000, and you're not, you know, you're an architect, a single architect. If you take $5,000 out of your bank account, your personal bank account, that's really $10,000, you know, because it's after-tax dollars. So we were looking for checks that were made payable to cash around times of fundraisers that were booked as business expense, like miscellaneous expense. And we were able to piece together that there was, you know, fundraising times, it might be $4,000 or $5,000 coming out of this one business bank account from miscellaneous expenses, and then focus on, well, what are the miscellaneous expenses? What documents do you have to back up those expenses? And and then we learned that, you know, they were for the, you know, eventually learned through testimony, sometimes bookkeepers or other people, that it was for a fundraiser. You know, there's funny things. There was I remember talking to one, there was one architect, and it really irritated him that he had to pay all this money. And there was another architect that worked with him, and he said, when you go to the fundraiser, I want you to head right for the shrimp and make sure you eat as many shrimp as you can, because it costs us about $100 a piece. So I mean, it's just really I mean, it's just I think that one of the things that I learned and what was so fascinating about the case was just the characters and just the, you know, the human nature being what it is, you know, the ability of certain people to justify what they were doing because everybody else was doing it. This human nature is, okay, if I have to do this, I want to get the most out of it. Not only am I going to get the job, but we want to make sure we, you know, drink enough or have enough shrimp. So,
I mentioned to you last week, I think I said this, maybe I didn't say it to everybody, but one of the architects that was involved in this journal special, I'm not going to mention his name, but he's well known in the state. And I reached out to him and asked to interview him for the book. And I know him through some other contacts. And he sent back a note to me. And he said, I should say what happened first, that he got raised from contributions at campaign events to envelopes full of cash that he didn't want to touch and had his wife do it. And so I sent him a letter and I said, I described some of the, you know, appreciating some of the really good work he had done. And I think, as Richard said about someone else, I think this is a good guy, an honest person who wanted to simply practice his architecture. But he got elevated from direct campaign contributions to what are called straw contributions, and then cash in envelopes. And there's the famous story about the governor with an envelope of $10,000 in his pocket. Maybe you'll tell that story, or shall I tell it?
go ahead, you can tell.
Well, just that he went to Walt's roast beef, which was next door to the DiPrete insurance office, just there by Reservoir Park in Cranston. And he got home and he realized he had lost his envelope of $10,000 cash. And so he went back to Walt's roast beef and was rummaging through the trash.
He was dumpster diving.
Dumpster diving. So, but I said to this architect, I wrote to this architect asking to interview him, and he wrote back, and I've got the letter, handwritten very poignantly, saying, I can't do this. I can't go back there. The memories are just too painful.
So he didn't find the $10,000?
He did.
Oh, I didn't know. I'm talking about the architect, not wanting
Okay.
to. Sorry.
I remember him saying to me, you know, when he became an architect, he just really wanted to build buildings. You know, the reason he became an architect, he wanted to build buildings to leave behind his legacy. And, you know, it's unfortunate that part of the legacy in building the buildings that he's leaving behind is a legacy of criminal activity and paying bribes, so he could build his buildings.
What was the percentage that do you remember? Was there? I thought it was 5% of the project.
I can't recall. I know that there were targets. Not everybody stepped up to the plate and paid what they were supposed to pay. So, you know, especially sometimes after the project was awarded, the motivation was much higher to pay before you got the project than ongoing. Once you had it, you know, they didn't. Obviously, if you wanted another one, you'd have to pay up for the first one.
So you and Walter Gorman and Bob Mattos. By the way, they called Bob Mattos the Cobra.
Yeah.
And I remember at one point in the State House, he came to me in the hallway of the State House. I'd never met the guy, I didn't know who he was, and introduced himself. He said, "I'm Bob Mattos," and he said, "I have the list." And I said, "What list?" And if you've read the Ethics Commission part, that the governor would get these lists of 3 firms or 4 firms, and then he would just make a check mark and send it back. And it was all very secret, and he had produced these 2 executive orders describing the Architects and Engineers Committee process so that everybody would see that this was open and honest and the governor wasn't trying to influence the outcome. And yet he was doing exactly the opposite in secret. So Bob Mattos said to me, "I've got the list." And I said, "What list?" And he said, "The list with the check marks that was going across from the governor's office to the Department of Administration." And that's how the contracts were then getting awarded. I think there's very little question now that the governor was heavily involved in this. I think you concur in that.
Yes.
Maybe you could, watching the clock, which is good, I can see it at this angle, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you got to the point of doing the indictments and then why you left the Attorney General's office.
Before you do that,
Yep.
did the governor, when he dumpstered that, did he fine $10,000?
Yes.
So he put it with his napkins.
He finished the,
So the question about the indictments and then your decision that you had to leave the Attorney General's office.
So we eventually brought the indictments against Dennis DiPrete, who was, basically, the governor wanted somebody obviously he could trust, and his son Dennis really stepped, his son Dennis was an engineer, and so he was very much involved in the solicitation and the collecting of the payments. We had by that point, Rodney Brucini was cooperating, Frank Zana was cooperating, a number of other architects, the architect that you mentioned, a couple of other architects, some construction managers. So we were able to gather significant amount of corroborating documentation to corroborate that these people were making either cash or significant donations, and donations through other people in their offices and other family members. So we brought the indictment, and we were in the process of, at that point, subsequent to bringing the indictment, the governor hired, there were two lawyers. There was, Dennis DiPrete had Bob Popio from Mintz-Levin in Boston, and Ed DiPrete had Richard Egbert, also from Boston. Very good lawyers. Richard Egbert, now deceased, was fairly well known in Rhode Island. I don't know if any of you had ever heard of him. He represented a lot of organized crime people. He's a very tenacious. He's got a mind. Some people are just born ability to cross-examine, because he was able to. He could remember facts. He had an encyclopedic memory, and I'm sure he was very well prepared, but he would remember, and he had an ability when he asked questions to put the emphasis on what he wanted. You knew what he was talking about, and he played very well in front of a jury. Bob Popio was, Mintz-Levin's a huge mega firm. There was another lawyer who was more responsible for the day-to-day. His name is John Markey. He's his brother of the Senator Markey from Massachusetts. At the time it was Congressman Markey. They were very, they were paper people. In fact, I first met them when we had subpoenaed Dennis DiPrete's records, tax returns from his accountant and financial records. And his accountant was in Massachusetts. And they moved to quash the subpoena. Does anybody know what move to quash is? I'm using all these little terms. Mel knows what the move to quash is.
Why don't you explain?
Okay. So there's a procedure where when you issue a subpoena, if you say that if the owner of the records can move to quash the subpoena. So Dennis DiPrete didn't own the records, his accountant owned the records, but he can move to quash the subpoena because they're his records. And you move on the basis of privilege, it's overly broad, it's irrelevant. They moved on the basis of privilege, accounting client privilege. Well, there's no such thing as an accountant client privilege. But that was, that case went, so not only did we go to the Rhode Island Supreme, there was there issues that went to the Rhode Island Supreme Court that you're well aware of in the pre-case, but the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which ruled emphatically that there is no accountant-client privilege. So we were able, because we were able to get those records. You might say, how can someone in Rhode Island subpoena records from somebody in Massachusetts? And what we had to do was get what's called an interstate subpoena. So we had to go to the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts and say, we have this ongoing criminal investigation in Rhode Island. These records we believe are relevant to that investigation. We're asking that you issue the subpoena through this interstate compact, and then when you get the records, give the records to us.
So you disclosed the indictments in January 1994, if my memory's correct.
Yes, it was. I think it was, the case was, I believe the indictment, P1 1994, I think it was 100 AD.
Actually, I'm thinking maybe it wasn't January, it was March, but it was the early spring of 1994. And you had, as I recall, about 18 specific criminal counts against the governor. But then 1994 is the election year, and Jeff Pine beat Jim O'Neill.
Correct. I believe Jeff Pine was the Attorney General.
Oh, actually, he won in 92, didn't he?
Yeah, he was the Attorney
So
General.
you were still there?
Yes.
When Jeff Pine was, I'm
Yes.
sorry, I got the date wrong.
Yeah, because Jeff Pine, so when Jeff Pine took over, Walter Gorman left to go and become about a year later, he became a judge. Obviously, Jim O'Neill was gone, and then, like any Attorney General, you bring in your own people. And it's just different. I mean, I don't really want to cast aspersions. It wasn't working for me with respect to the people that were assigned to assist and to work on the case once it had been indicted and to get it ready for trial. I tend to be pretty, I'm pretty precise, and I like to make sure that everything's in order. And there's other people that just don't practice law that way, and I was just, I was not excited about the prospect of trying the case with the people that I was going to be trying the case with.
I will be a little less circumspect.
That would be nice.
Well, you see it in the book, the two guys that came in were first Mike Burns, who had been, done some significant criminal prosecutions, but not with white collar and not this kind of documentation. And second was Joseph DiCaprio, who had had some, is that how you pronounce it?
DiCaprio, yeah.
So he had had some significant personal problems and had been censured by the court, and yet wound up in charge of this case. And so imagine I'm saying this sympathetically for Richard's sake here, imagine if you're under that supervisory order and expected to make this case work, and those guys are telling you what to do all the time. I would have resigned too. I was very sorry when you did. A lot of us were afraid at that point that the whole thing was going to get down the tubes, and in fact it did. As you remember, they had problems with disclosure, discovery, and maybe you would just describe what happened.
So what happened was, under Rule 16, which is the Rules of Criminal Procedure, the prosecution has an obligation to disclose all evidence, specifically with respect to promises, rewards, and inducements, which is very important from a defense point of view, because you want to know what promises were made to this witness in order to get that witness to cooperate. And the issue came up with respect to what promises were made to Rodney Brusini in order to convince Rodney Brusini to cooperate. And not all of the information, not all of the promises, rewards, and inducements were disclosed, which is which is really a violation of the responsibilities of the Attorney General to disclose. I mean, basically, as an Assistant Attorney General, it's not all about winning the case, it's about making sure that justice is done, and every defendant, whether they're guilty or not guilty, certainly has a right to know what promises are made to the people that are going to testify against him. And they were not disclosed. And there were some other documents that were not turned over. So there was a motion to dismiss the indictment on the basis of prosecutorial misconduct that was made. And there was a lengthy hearing before Judge Cresto. In fact, I had to testify at that hearing. I was no longer at the Attorney General's office, but I was subpoenaed to testify. And I was on the stand for a full week. With respect to, in fact, there's, I don't have them, but back in the journal, you get up in the morning and you see a picture on the front page, right there. So it's not a very pleasant experience. But after that hearing, Judge Cresto dismissed the indictment on the basis of prosecutorial misconduct. The state appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reversed, saying that he should not have, that he exceeded his discretion, that the remedy would have been to postpone the case, to give the information, but that basically the people of the state of Rhode Island have a right to have a trial on these issues, not to have it dismissed. And then after that, the end of the story, that the governor did end up admitting to certain of the allegations.
And there was tragedy here. Let me just say this, and then we'll stop and take questions. In that Mike Burns, who became the head of the criminal division, wound up committing suicide. I don't know what happened to DeCapperall, but Jeff Pine wound up not running for re-election in 1998, but did go in December of 1998 when the final plea was read out in court, and at that point the governor acknowledged his responsibility for these crimes and was sentenced to a year in prison and so on. So I think that's a very quick summary. I mean, Richard's comment, yeah. I didn't realize it was a whole week you were on the stage.
Yeah, one of the things I think that one of the takeaways that I had from, I think, Jeff Pine's an honorable person and a good man, but we all make mistakes, and I think that Jeff's mistake was that he wanted he wanted people around him that he liked Mike Burns, and I think he liked the way Mike carried himself. Mike had a very irreverent sense of humor, and he brought some people in like that. He ran into some problems with respect to the person he brought in to run the drug task force. And I think we see this sometimes in people that are in power, is they're sort of blind to the weaknesses of the people that they have around them, because they're their friends, they're basically good and honorable people, but they have certain weaknesses. They might be a little bit lazy, they might not be, everybody has weaknesses. In fact, somebody once said to me, we can only be good at 3 or 4 different things. So you should surround yourself with people that are good at things that you're not good at. You don't surround yourself with people that are good at the same things as you are, or that are just going to be yes people. And I think that I know you're learning about secrets and scandals, but I think sometimes people start out well, and they might have honorable intentions, but they surround themselves sometimes with the wrong people, friends that go way back, and they become blinded to those weaknesses. And then when things are so far along, there's nothing they can do to extricate themselves from it.
Let's take questions. Let's start over here, and then go there, and then back there.
Okay.
Good and loud, please.
Okay, you talked about the prosecution not revealing all the information that they should have. Was that a direct result of the governor telling them not to do this?
Oh, no, I don't know why certain things weren't turned over.
Oh, it wasn't
It would have been the
intentional.
Attorney
It
General's,
wasn't inten-
it was in the Attorney General's office.
Uh-huh.
There was a prosecutor, so after I left, they put a prosecutor by the name of, I won't say his name, but there was a prosecutor who didn't have a lot of trial experience, who was put in charge of basically doing the grunt work for the case, which would be responding to discovery requests, making sure that everything was disclosed. And there were certain things that he did not disclose in response to discovery. So he was a member of the Attorney General's staff.
So it was not an intentional situation? You don't-
I don't
I
know.
don't think so.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, two questions.
Good and loud, though.
Okay, you mentioned Rodney Brusini. I don't know if everybody knows who he is.
No,
Who is Rodney Brusini?
Okay, Rodney Brusini was a insurance broker who worked with Ed DiPrete at the DiPrete Insurance Agency. So he was someone that was involved in Cranston politics when the governor was the mayor of
He
Cranston.
didn't work on his staff. He wasn't a.
No,
He
no.
never worked in government.
I don't believe he ever worked in government, and he worked with the governor at the insurance agency, and he was basically his chief fundraiser.
I see. One more question. Dennis DiPrete is a very successful engineer today. How did he get away with that? Did he go to prison?
No, he did not.
He wound up pleading to one count and getting, I think, $1,000 fine or something like that. When I interviewed Governor DiPrete in, I want to say 2009 or 2010 maybe, alone in this house where he'd entertained the President of the United States, he insisted to me that he really had not done anything wrong, and that he had only taken this course of pleading guilty because he didn't want to have Dennis, have it all fall on Dennis. He even went so far as to say that Jim O'Neill, the Attorney General, had come to his house with a state police officer and said they really didn't have anything on him. And I found that utterly impossible to believe. And I went and interviewed Jim O'Neill about that twice, and in different ways he also said, never happened, I never went there to do that. So I think I came out with was a sense that somehow Governor DiPrete had come to the conclusion that he really had not done anything worse than prior governors and so on, and that he just, he was doing what he had to do, and he got caught, and he didn't want it all to destroy his family. I feel heartbroken about that, but I think he's wrong. Go ahead, Jim.
And I think that what happens is, and I don't remember who told it to me, but what happens to people in politics sometimes is they see other people around them making a lot of money on these projects, and they're the guy that got them these projects, and that they have an obligation basically to share the wealth.
Back here, and then I'm going to back to Jeff, and then I'll come over. Yeah. Good and loud.
From what I got from the book, you were sort of like the Lone Ranger and standing up to the big guys, pretty big guys and people, a whole system full of people. And I wonder how you persevered in that. I know eventually you felt you had to exit the situation, but how did you persevere in all of that? Did you have support from other people? Did you ever doubt yourself and think, well, if this is the way everybody does it, maybe they're right and I'm wrong? Or how did you get through all that?
Well, I mean, I was being helped. I had people like Bob Mattos that was working on the case. There was another young investigator, Peter Blessing, he was a Princeton grad. He had basically he was from Narragansett. He ended up working at the Attorney General's office before he went off to business school. And Jim O'Neill was very supportive. I mean, he really, and people like Walter Gorman were very supportive and gave us the time to do the case. And we knew that, it's a slow process, but as you start building, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, as you start building the case, you have something there. And I think what the problem is that you have to, in doing this type of investigation, you can't follow every lead. You have to keep following, like, what is your goal? What do you want to accomplish? What's the goal of the investigation? Because you can get yourself lost in following this lead or that lead. So I felt supported. I mean, at times I felt that there was pressure to complete it, to get it done. A lot of time went into it. Obviously, you're working on something. People that you work for want to see results. But I didn't feel like I wasn't supported at all.
I'm not calling people by name because of what Dave said at the beginning, so.
Yeah. My recollection at the time, back in the early part of DiPrete's administration, I believe this was as early as '85, in his first year, there were already indications of pay-to-play with Joe Pezza at the Department of Administration, road contracts, and so forth.
With Tutela.
Yes. Could you put sort of the trail of all this pay-to-play as part of the whole
Yeah, I mean,
because it started much earlier than this.
well, I
and
think
people knew
from
about
our
it.
investigation, it started in Cranston.
Right.
I mean, basically, the same people that were in play in positions of power for fundraising and getting jobs in Cranston became in that same position. And I mean, I don't want to name names here, but I'll say Frank Zano because he's identified as someone, the Rodney Brucinis, but there were other people, people in the legal profession. I mean, there's just DiPrete had a very sophisticated fundraising, if you want to call it that, fundraising machine. And I remember being disappointed because, and I'm not going to say again the name of the person, but someone that had a very good reputation in the city of Providence actually ran for mayor of Providence, was a Republican, a well-known Republican from one of the big families. And I remember saying to, I mean, you can,
I think you just said it.
but in any event, I said, I was talking to him one time, I said, how could, you get involved in this? How could you let this sort of stuff happen? He said, well, patronage isn't a bad thing. And I said, this is beyond patronage. I mean, this isn't getting somebody a job, at the Registry of Motor Vehicles. This is beyond patronage.
I think we have time for one more question, but we got, well, I was going to go over here. All right, we'll come back here to, wow. I'm looking at Dave for time here. Go ahead. Good night, yeah.
I agree pay to play is the way it seems to go. Why does it seem that Rhode Island is plagued with this, or is Chicago, is Connecticut, is Hartford, have these, I don't know how you measure the frequency and the propensity of the population in government to participate in this kind of thing, but if you do that, is there a measure, first of all? And second of all, are we as bad as we seem, or is it because we live here first?
I mean, I obviously don't have the answer to that question, but I mean,
Well, I think
that one of the things that I think one of the problems that we have in Rhode Island is we have, and I don't know, I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of, we don't have a lot of, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of oversight. The executive doesn't have as much power as the legislative branch. There's not a lot of legislative oversight over the executive branch. And I think that, in Rhode Island we have 2 degrees of separation rather than 6 degrees of separation. And everybody knows it's like somebody's brother-in-law or this or that, and there's just not as much. I think that we and I think it's changed, I think it's changed over the years, but it was almost, you know, this is just the way it's done. I don't think we're any worse than any place else. I think that human nature is human nature. I just think there might be more opportunities here because there's less structure. I mean, the way that DiPrete set up, for example, the selection of construction managers, that you gave them, once it's not based on, once you bring the political people in that are involved in the selection, then there could be other reasons that you're selecting that person. So, I mean, a lot of larger states have professional people that have protection to keep their jobs, that are going out and ranking the people, ranking the bidders based on what they've done, and there's no question that it's based on what they've contributed to the various politicians. So I think that we have less structures in place where other states are more professionally managed, and by having the ability to influence the selection process, if you have someone who might be less than honest, it's a perfect opening to collect.
I would go one step beyond that. In the Department of Environmental Management, which was an executive agency, you had Judith Benedict and Bob Bendick, and she clearly was upset when she went to represent Bendick at the Architects and Engineers meeting in April of 1988, and they overrode the recommendation. She had a panel of professionals in DEM recommend these firms, and they said there are only 2 firms that are qualified. It doesn't make sense to, you know, but they said this is how we do it. And so they overrode her, but then she went back to her office and wrote precisely what had happened, gave that memo to Bob Bendick, her boss as head of DEM, and he rightly sent it to Fred Lippitt, who was the director of administration, who then lost it on his desk. And then eventually, I don't know whether Judith did it, Judy did it, and Sam knows her better than I do. I only met her face-to-face once. But they went ahead and they sent it up to the EPA in Boston. And so EPA calls back to Lippitt and says, you can't do this contract. This is crazy. And at that point, Lippitt then has to call that DiPrete, so you know where the decision really came from, at the Republican National Convention, and says, can I change this selection? DiPrete says, yeah, change the selection. But the point was, in that set of exchanges, you see the whole pattern. So the hope is now that we'll have more oversight, except as we look at 38 Studios, you say, well, I think we've had some more, but it broke down again in 38 Studios, and that's the whole thing we won't talk about today. Let's take just one of you decide which one's going to ask the question.
I just want to clarify quickly.
Good and loud.
When you were in, your partner, the state policeman, worked for Jim O'Neill, and
Well, actually, Bob Mattis worked for the state police. He was assigned to work on this case by the Rhode Island State Police, but he reported to the state police.
And then when these other 2 gentlemen came in after you and Bob, this was pretty much, from what I got out of the book, it sounds like the apples and oranges, they weren't ready for prime time players in terms of this kind of thing.
I mean, I don't really want to comment on that. I mean, I just decided that it was more, you know, that I would rather do something else.
Yeah.
And actually, in hindsight, it worked out very well for me. My career has gone well, and I got to be on the Common Cause board, and I met people like Mel Zurier. There comes a time in everybody's career when you do something, you just say, I'm ready for a change.
I want to say one thing before I think I would maybe let that be the last question for now, if that's all right.
Thank you.
I don't want to cut you off, but I want to just say one final thing about Richard, that some may remember it, some may not. There was a case a number of years ago of a young guy named Derek Hazard, who was, I don't know, was he finally convicted?
Well, he had been convicted when I took.
When you stepped in,
Yeah.
but Richard stepped up and went back and looked at what had happened to Derek Hazard's case, and basically broke it open by recognizing that Derek Hazard, young black man from the South Side, had incompetent or unprofessional representation, and went ahead and got that case reopened. And how did that end?
Well, what happened was, the basis of the reopening was that there was an automobile stop in New Jersey. They were on their way to, Derek Hazard had an alibi, but the problem with that is we allege that that's newly discovered evidence. It was the same judge, Judge Cresto, ruled that the evidence wasn't newly discovered because by its very nature, Derek Hazard would have known that they were stopped by, if he was actually in the car, they were stopped by the New Jersey State Police. We also had a hearing regarding ineffective assistance of counsel, and we did not win that hearing. Ineffective assistance of counsel is very difficult to prove, and Judge Gale was the judge on that, but we had a hearing on it.
I think we've taken as much time as we can, and I am so grateful for your questions and for Richard's character. Bottom line in all of this that I see in retrospect is that you find people with real character in these positions who are willing to stand up and not be rolled, and someone who have the courage to do that, and this guy's one of them, and I am so grateful.
Thank you very much.